All right, so I went ahead and I printed my photo out, and I printed it in black and white because we're doing a black and white drawing. The focus here is on proportions and value. I don't want to be confused by color. Color can complicate getting accurate values because different colors kind of have different like base values or inherent values. For example, a pure yellow is always going to be lighter than a pure blue. Now, you can grid the entire image. If you do that though, you need to be sure that the grid on your drawing paper is proportional. So let's say you have a 1/2 inch grid here. So let's say you've got three columns and 4 rows. And each of these are a 1/2 inch square. Well, on your larger drawing paper, you should have an equal number of columns and an equal number of rows. And it should be proportionally larger. So if you make these columns 1 inch wide over here, that's twice as wide as the original. So the height needs to also be twice as wide. So this is a 1:2 proportion. We're scaling it up by 2. Okay, so that's one option. If you do this, use a ruler. Use a straight edge. If you don't have a ruler, find a cutting board or a book or a magazine, something that is a straight edge to use to draw your straight lines, all right? Now, I am not going to draw this kind of uniform grid, but I am going to create a grid, draw some reference lines for myself. Now, remember when we did our sugar skulls? Now, a head is about 2/3 as wide as it is tall. So if you measure 2/3 of the height, that is how wide it is. So 2/3 wide as it is tall. 2/3 to 1. We're doing proportions here. Now, or 2 to 3 is also accurate. This is 2 parts to this one's 3 parts, each part being equal. Now, halfway is the eye line. This is not 1/2 inch, this is halfway. I just realized I wrote 1/5 here. I meant to write 1/2. Then 1/3 is the bottom of the nose. Nose takes up this whole length. And at 2/3 is the brow. Now, these are average proportions of a human head. So each of us is a little bit different. We're each unique. We're each built and shaped and sized a little differently. So your portrait may not be exactly these proportions, but it should be very, very close. My portrait, she has her head at a slight angle. That's why the nostril, her left nostril, the nostril on the right of the image though, is more rounded and I can see more of it than the one on the left. The left is just this little sliver because she's holding her head at an angle. So the first thing I'm going to draw is the center line of her face. So I'm going to cut straight through the center of her nose and her lips to her chin, follow the bridge of her nose up over her forehead, and then back to the edge of her head. All right, so that is the midline of her face. Next, now also the ears, they land between the eye line and the nose as well. Now, the top of her ear is way down here, so that shows me I'm actually angled up slightly at looking up at her head, or she's tilting her head back a tad. So this line of her eye line, I'm going to cut straight through the center of her eyes, but then I'm going to follow the curve of her cheek down slightly to her ear. And then the nose, same thing, bottom of the nose, and curve slightly down to her ear. Now, if we measure from her chin to her eye line, and then from her eye line to the top edge of her head, it should be about equal, which it is here. So her eyes are halfway up her head. Now her nose is about 1/3. That's accurate. 2, 3. Now 2/3, if this is 1/3, 2/3 is right here, just above her brows. So that's pretty accurate to standard. The brow line, where the ridge of your eye socket turns into your forehead, is 2/3 up the head. Now, something to note is that, remember, a lot of those tutorials had us drawing a perfect circle. If you were in class, we used a compass, and then we drew the jaw below it to start out. So the top of your skull is roughly a sphere, but then your jaw, your mandible, extends below that. That's why I usually start with just an oval, because overall it's generally an oval. But your mandible, the bottom part of your jaw that moves, that doesn't go all the way back to the back of your skull. It stops right at your ear. So that means the back of her head is way back here, but her jaw is right here. And the sphere of her head, it connects to her neck. So see, the neck is behind the jaw. Do you see that? Right here. And that's because she has her head at an angle. Okay, so the other side of her head is back here. This is the top edge of her shoulder, actually, somewhere about right there. Here's the back edge, because her arm is coming towards us because she's holding her phone. This is a selfie. Gonna kind of outline the phone here, too. And it's a bit dark, but this is the hem of this scarf shawl thing she has, and her hair is filling in this area. All right, and then here is the top edge of her arm, and then her hand is right there. I'm just gonna block it in for now. All right, so now, and this is her collarbone, though you can't see it. Okay, so now I have a basic structure that I can build around. I'm gonna go ahead and mark the edge of that shadow too on her neck, because that's a pretty strong shadow. I'm also going to go ahead and measure the halfway point. So even when you don't do a full grid like this, it can still be helpful to mark the halfway point of your composition. To make a straight line that is parallel to the edges of your image, you should make 2 marks and then connect them. This isn't necessarily half of her head. This is half of my composition, half of my page. I'm doing this to help me scale it up so that I maintain the same proportions in my drawing. All right, so see, one side of her head is taking up a much larger portion than the other side of her head, almost twice. It's almost twice as wide. Now, on my drawing paper, 9 by 12 inches, I'm going to use my HB pencil. So this is just your regular number 2 pencil. It's not super hard, but not super soft either. And I'm going to mark the halfway point. So 9 inches, half of 9 is 4.5. So I'm going to measure 4.5 from the side here, and 4.5 from the side up there. And then I'm going to connect it. Now, this is very important. Draw any grid lines, any reference lines very lightly. Just barely holding your pencil, just lightly drag it across the page. Don't apply hardly any pressure at all, because you don't want it to be visible in your final drawing. You want to make sure that it will either be erased or hidden in shadow by the time you're done. If I draw it too dark and then I have a really bright highlight that's still like the white of the page, you're still going to see a shadow of that line because I'm not going to be able to erase it all the way. Remember, paper has a texture, it has a tooth, and the graphite from your pencil, when you press hard, you are grinding it into the fibers of the paper. So that's why it gets hard to erase dark lines. All right, so now I need to draw this oval of her head. And I can see it comes, let's see if that's half of this half and a fourth. It's almost to the edge. It's more than 3/4. So it goes from about right here to not quite halfway on this side. So if that's halfway, it's about there. And then on the bottom, it's about halfway. So 1/4 up the page is where her chin lies, and the top of her head is a little, it's more of a distance than her ear there, but not much. About there, I'd say. Drawing ovals, I have an easier time drawing them wider than tall, so I'm going to turn my paper. I'm also standing up here, and notice that how I'm holding my pencil, I'm not holding it straight up, I'm not gripped up on it real tight. I am just loosely holding it at a pretty flat angle, and I'm moving from my shoulder and my elbow. My wrist is set. I'm not bending my wrist, because your wrist has such a limited motion. You can't make a curve wider than this, and you can't extend wider than your wrist. So it's not going to allow you to draw a smooth oval from this point. So moving from your shoulder and your elbow, I'm going to kind of trace it in the air first. Top of it was actually slightly to the right. As you can see, I usually do it very sketchy. I have a lot of lines. I describe it as searching for the line. Then I'll go back and I'll start figuring out, okay, which of these bajillion lines is the right one, and may even start working out the more specific shape of the head as well, because it's not a perfect oval, really. All right, that's pretty close. I'm going to go in and erase some of these extra lines now so I don't get confused. All right, now her nose, the tip of her nose crosses about right there. And then chin is just about perfectly on this midline of the page. Then it crosses and her nose goes up and then curves into the top of her head. Comparing this angle to this angle, pretty close. Her brow line is about halfway between this line and the top of her head. So about right there. And it's angled down a little bit. Then her eye line's halfway up her head, about there. Comparing how high from this midpoint, the right edge of it, her eye line is to the left. And then 1/3 her nose. Her ear is in here, just kind of roughly marking its place. Worry about the exact size of it later. Then her jawline is right there. Center of her mouth is about 1/3 of the way down this bottom section. So about right there is the center of her mouth. Nose, I'm going to break it down into a couple of circles. So when you're doing smaller circles, you can do it from your wrist. I just totally misplaced that. I think I've got this end of her nose too far over. Okay, comparing it to my crosshairs here. Little sliver of that far nostril. And there's the close one. Her eye. Now, the whole eye area is pretty large, but her actual eye, the opening, is very small. That is one of the most common mistakes when people start drawing portraits. They make the eyes too large. Let's see if this is the halfway point here. So 1/4 across the page. There's the far edge of her nostril. And this eye is very close to the midway line. I think I may have actually drawn this too small. All right, so not quite the right shape, probably not quite the right size, but they're marked in, so they're not going to disappear on me. Her cheeks are pretty high. You see this shadow right there? That's from the curve of her cheek. So I'm actually going to mark that, the edge of that. And her hair is overlapping. There's her hairline. Hand is here. If I follow the imaginary line of her jaw, if I kind of extend it around her head, that's where her hairline, this edge of her hairline is. I don't want to get too detailed with her hair right now because I haven't worked in the edges of her face. And I don't want to do a bunch of work that I then have to erase. But so I'm just making a couple of lines so I remember, like, hey, that's where her hair goes. Then her neck, her shoulder, about 1/8 of the way up the page, so 1/4 up this section. Draw a vertical line down from this point where her jaw and her ear meet. Drawn shadow here. It's kind of where the top of her shoulder and her collarbone would be if we could see them through her clothes, which we can't, but I'm going to go ahead and kind of mark them in for reference. And the edge of her phone is a little above where this corner of her neck and her shoulder. Hit. And just past the midline. And about 2/3 the way over. Corner of the shaw. All right, so now I have a pretty good grid, pretty good structure that I can build from. So at this point, I will start adding in the shadows and details.